She was forced to go to a luxury party dressed very simply, but the Tycoon's gaze changed everything. The ballroom glittered like a trap made of diamonds and champagne. Jane stood at the edge of it all, fingers twisting the cheap fabric of her dress, trying to convince herself she belonged there. She didn't. Not in that world of silk and secrets, where every smile had a price and every handshake sealed a deal she couldn't begin to understand. But he saw her anyway. Across the room, through the sea of designer gowns and tailored suits, Robert's eyes found hers. And in that single moment, everything shifted. The air, the rules, the carefully built walls she'd spent years hiding behind. This is a story about power and vulnerability, about a woman who had nothing and a man who had everything to lose, about the kind of connection that doesn't ask for permission and doesn't follow the rules, the kind that changes you, whether you're ready or not. If you want to know what happens when two people from opposite worlds collide in the most dangerous way possible, stay with me. Subscribe to hear more stories like this, and comment below. Tell me where you're listening from. I want to know who's brave enough to step into this world with me. Now, let me take you back to where it all began. Jane had learned long ago that survival meant saying yes to things that made her stomach turn. Tonight was no different. The invitation had arrived 3 days ago, hand-delivered by a man in a black suit who didn't smile. Her stepmother, Victoria, had been the one to open it, of course. Jane hadn't been consulted. She never was. Victoria had simply looked at her with that cold, calculating expression she'd perfected over the years and said, "You're going. Wear something that won't embarrass us." The problem was, Jane didn't own anything that would fit into a world like this. She stood now in front of the full-length mirror in her bedroom, staring at the pale blue dress she'd bought from a discount store 2 years ago. It was simple. Too simple. The fabric was cotton, not silk. The hem fell just below her knees in a way that was modest and utterly unremarkable. There were no crystals, no lace, no dramatic neckline. It was the kind of dress a schoolteacher might wear to a casual dinner, not a high-society gala attended by people who measured worth in millions. Her fingers trembled as she smoothed down the skirt for the 100th time. It didn't help. She still looked like exactly what she was, an outsider trying to blend into a world that would chew her up and spit her out without a second thought. "Jane!" Victoria's voice cut through the closed door like a blade. "The car is here. Move." Jane swallowed the knot of anxiety lodging itself in her throat and grabbed her small clutch, the only remotely formal accessory she owned. It was worn at the edges, the clasp slightly bent, but it would have to do. Everything about tonight would have to do because there was no alternative. Victoria had made that clear. The mansion was a 40-minute drive into the heart of the city, through streets Jane rarely traveled. She watched the buildings change from familiar brick apartments to gleaming glass towers that seemed to pierce the sky. The wealth here wasn't just visible. It was oppressive, a weight that pressed down on her chest and made breathing feel like work. Victoria sat across from her in the town car, scrolling through her phone with manicured nails that clicked against the screen. She hadn't said a word since they'd left the house. Jane knew better than to break the silence. Her stepmother only spoke when she had something to criticize. And tonight, Jane was already bracing for impact. The car slowed as they approached a sprawling estate, its iron gates parting like the jaws of some elegant beast. Jane's pulse quickened. Through the window, she could see the mansion rising against the twilight sky, its white stone facade glowing with warm light. People in evening gowns and tuxedos moved like shadows through the grand entrance, their laughter drifting on the cool evening air. She didn't belong here. The thought repeated itself like a mantra as the car rolled to a stop in front of the red-carpeted steps. A valet opened Victoria's door first, offering his hand with practiced ease. Victoria stepped out without acknowledging him, smoothing down her emerald green gown, a designer piece that probably cost more than Jane's entire wardrobe combined. Jane's door opened next. The valet's eyes flickered over her dress, and she saw it. The faint hesitation, the momentary confusion. He recovered quickly, offering his hand with the same professional smile, but the damage was done. She felt it settle over her like a second skin. Inadequacy. "Thank you," she murmured, stepping onto the carpet. Her shoes, simple black flats, made no sound against the plush fabric. Victoria was already halfway up the steps, her heels clicking sharply against the stone. Jane hurried to follow, clutching her purse tight against her side. The grand entrance loomed ahead, its double doors thrown wide to reveal a foyer dripping with crystal chandeliers and marble floors that reflected the light like water. Music drifted from somewhere deeper inside the mansion, a string quartet playing something classical and haunting. Jane's chest tightened. She'd never been to a party like this, never been anywhere like this. Her world was small and carefully controlled, a series of routines designed to keep her invisible. This was the opposite of invisible. This was exposure. They passed through the foyer and into the main ballroom, and Jane's breath caught. The space was enormous, its high ceilings adorned with intricate plasterwork and gold leaf that caught the light from dozens of chandeliers. Tables draped in white linen lined the edges of the room, each one laden with flowers and candles and glasses of champagne that sparkled like liquid starlight. At the center, couples danced to the music, their movements fluid and effortless, as if they'd been born knowing how to navigate this world. Jane felt like she was watching a movie, something unreal, something she had no business being part of. "Stay close," Victoria said without looking at her. "And for God's sake, don't embarrass me." Jane nodded, though her stepmother wasn't paying attention. Victoria had already spotted someone across the room, a woman in a red gown with diamonds glittering at her throat, and was making her way toward her with the kind of purposeful stride that left no room for hesitation. Jane followed, feeling the weight of 100 unseen eyes. She told herself it was paranoia, that no one was actually looking at her. But she could feel it anyway, the way her simple dress stood out against the sea of silk and satin, the way her bare neck seemed almost indecent compared to the jewelry dripping from everyone else. She was a mistake, a miscalculation, and everyone in this room knew it. Victoria stopped at a cluster of elegantly dressed women, all of whom greeted her with air kisses and practiced smiles. Jane hung back, trying to make herself small. She didn't recognize any of them, but they all had the same look, polished, poised, untouchable. They spoke in low, lilting voices about things Jane didn't understand: charity auctions, yacht parties, someone's summer home in the Hamptons. No one acknowledged her. It was as if she didn't exist. Jane let her gaze drift, scanning the room for something, anything, to anchor herself to. That's when she saw him. He stood near the far wall, half hidden in the shadow cast by one of the towering marble columns. Tall, broad-shouldered, dark suit that fit him like it had been made to worship every line of his frame. His hair was black, pushed back in a way that was casual but deliberate, and his jaw was sharp enough to cut glass. But it wasn't his appearance that stopped her breath. It was the way he was looking at her. His eyes, dark, unreadable, were locked on hers with an intensity that made her skin prickle. Not the polite glance of a stranger, not the dismissive sweep of someone cataloging her inadequacy. This was something else, something that felt like a hand closing around her throat. Not to hurt, but to hold. Jane's pulse stuttered. She should look away. She knew that, but she couldn't. His gaze pinned her in place, stripping away every carefully constructed defense she'd built and leaving her raw. Exposed. He didn't smile, didn't move, just watched her with the kind of focus that made the rest of the room dissolve into background noise. Her chest rose and fell faster than it should. Her fingers tightened around her clutch until the cheap leather dug into her palm. She didn't know who he was, didn't know why he was looking at her like she was the only person in the room, but she felt it. The shift. The crack in the foundation of the world she thought she understood. And then, slowly, deliberately, he began to move toward her. Jane's heart slammed against her ribs. Panic flared hot and immediate. She wasn't ready for this, wasn't ready for whatever this was, but the crowd seemed to part for him, as if even the people around him instinctively knew to make way. He walked with the kind of confidence that didn't need to announce itself, each step measured and certain, like a predator closing the distance on something it had already decided to claim. She should run. The thought flickered through her mind, sharp and urgent, but her feet stayed rooted to the floor, her body refusing to obey the warning bells screaming in her head. He stopped 3 feet away from her, close enough that she could see the faint shadow of stubble along his jaw, the way his tie sat perfectly against the crisp white of his shirt, the almost imperceptible rise and fall of his chest as he breathed. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Jane's mouth went dry. She could feel the heat radiating off him, could smell the faint trace of something expensive, cologne mixed with wood and smoke. Her mind scrambled for words, for some semblance of composure, but all she could do was stare up at him, caught in the gravitational pull of his presence. "You don't belong here," he said finally. His voice was low, rough around the edges, like gravel smoothed by water. It wasn't a question, it was a statement. A fact delivered without malice, but with the kind of certainty that left no room for argument. Jane flinched. The words landed like a slap, even though his tone hadn't been cruel. She wanted to defend herself, to say something sharp and clever that would put him in his place. But the truth was, he was right. She didn't belong here. And somehow, he'd seen through her in the span of a heartbeat. Her voice cracked. She cleared her throat, trying again. "I was invited." His eyes narrowed slightly, as if he was weighing her words, deciding whether they mattered. Then, inexplicably, the corner of his mouth twitched. Not quite a smile. More like the shadow of one. "That's not what I meant," he said. Jane blinked. Confusion tangled with the fear still thrumming through her veins. "Then what did you mean?" He tilted his head, studying her with the kind of attention that made her feel like he was cataloging every detail. The way her hair fell in loose waves over her shoulders, the simple cut of her dress, the nervous flutter of her pulse at the base of her throat. "You're real," he said quietly. "Everyone else in this room is playing a part. But you're just here. You don't know how rare that is." Jane's breath hitched. She didn't know how to respond to that, didn't know if it was a compliment or an observation or something else entirely. All she knew was that the way he was looking at her made her feel like she was standing on the edge of something vast and unknowable, and one wrong step would send her plummeting. "Who are you?" she managed to whisper. His expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, something dark and complicated. "Robert," he said. Then after a pause, "And you?" "Jane." He repeated her name, the syllable rolling off his tongue like he was tasting it, testing its weight. "Jane," he said again, softer this time. "Why are you here, Jane?" The question should have been simple, but the way he asked it, like he was asking something deeper, something that had nothing to do with the party, made her chest tighten. "I don't know," she admitted. And it was the truth. She didn't know why Victoria had insisted she come, didn't know what game her stepmother was playing. All she knew was that she'd been brought here like a pawn on a chessboard, and she had no idea what move came next. Robert's jaw tightened. For a moment, he looked like he wanted to say something, but he held back, the words trapped behind the hard line of his mouth. "Stay close to me tonight," he said instead. Jane's eyes widened. "What? This isn't a safe place for someone like you." His voice dropped, taking on an edge that sent a chill down her spine. "If you're smart, you'll stay where I can see you." Before she could ask what he meant, before she could process the warning buried in his words, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd as smoothly as he'd appeared. Jane stood frozen, her heart racing, her mind spinning. She didn't know who Robert was, didn't know why he'd singled her out or what danger he thought she was in. But as she looked around the glittering ballroom, at the smiling faces and the clinking glasses and the laughter that suddenly sounded just a little too sharp, she realized something. She believed him. Jane didn't move for a full minute after Robert disappeared into the crowd. Her body felt locked in place, as if his presence had left an invisible imprint on the air around her, and stepping away from it would somehow break whatever fragile thread had been spun between them. "Stay close to me tonight." The words echoed in her mind, low and steady, like the beat of a drum she couldn't ignore. She didn't understand them, didn't understand him, but the warning in his voice had been real. She'd heard it in the way his tone shifted, from curious to something darker, something protective, and that terrified her more than anything else. "Jane." She jumped, her hand flying to her chest as Victoria appeared beside her, materializing out of nowhere like a specter. Her stepmother's expression was tight, her lips pressed into a thin line that Jane had learned to recognize as barely contained irritation. "What did he say to you?" Victoria asked, her voice low enough that it wouldn't carry to the women still chatting nearby. Jane's mind scrambled. "Who?" "Don't play stupid. Robert Harrington. What did he want?" The name hit Jane like a punch to the gut. Robert Harrington. She knew that name. Everyone did. The Harrington family was old money, the kind that stretched back generations and came with power that didn't need to announce itself. But Robert himself was something else entirely. She'd seen his name in the news, always in connection with things that skirted the edge of legality. Business deals that seemed too good to be true. Partnerships that ended badly for the other party. Rumors, never confirmed, always whispered, about the kind of influence that didn't come from boardrooms alone. He was dangerous, and Victoria knew it. He just introduced himself, Jane said carefully, keeping her voice steady. That's all. Victoria's eyes narrowed. Why would he introduce himself to you? The disdain in her stepmother's voice was a familiar sting, but tonight it felt sharper. Because Victoria wasn't wrong. Why would someone like Robert Harrington approach her? Jane was nobody. A girl in a cheap dress who didn't even have her own money, let alone the kind of connections that mattered in a room like this. I don't know, Jane admitted. Victoria's gaze swept over her, cold and assessing. For a moment, Jane thought she might press further, might demand answers Jane didn't have. But then her stepmother's expression shifted, smoothing into something calculated. Stay out of his way, Victoria said flatly. Men like that don't waste time on people unless they want something. And you have nothing to give. The words were meant to cut, and they did. But before Jane could respond, Victoria turned on her heel and walked away, rejoining the group of women who greeted her with the same false warmth they'd shown before. Jane exhaled slowly, the tension in her shoulders easing just enough to let her move again. She glanced around the ballroom, searching for a corner where she could disappear, somewhere she could ride out the rest of this nightmare without drawing more attention to herself. But as her eyes scanned the room, they found him again. Robert stood near the bar now, a glass of something amber in his hand. He wasn't looking at her, not directly, but she could feel his awareness, the way his focus shifted just enough to track her movements, even while he appeared to be engaged in conversation with a man in a gray suit. Stay close to me tonight. The memory of his voice sent a shiver down her spine. She didn't know what he meant by that. Didn't know if it was a threat or a promise, but something in her gut told her that he wasn't the kind of man who said things he didn't mean. Jane turned away, forcing herself to move toward one of the tall windows that lined the far wall. The glass was cool against her fingertips as she touched it, grounding herself in the sensation. Outside, the estate's gardens stretched into darkness, lit only by the soft glow of lanterns placed along winding stone paths. It looked peaceful, quiet. Everything this ballroom wasn't. She pressed her forehead against the glass, closing her eyes for just a moment. She could do this. She just had to survive the next few hours, smile when necessary, stay out of everyone's way, and then she could leave. Go home. Forget this night ever happened. You look like you're planning an escape. Jane's eyes snapped open. She spun around, her back hitting the window as Robert stepped into view. He'd moved without sound, closing the distance between them so quickly she hadn't even registered his approach. Up close, he was even more overwhelming than before. Taller, broader. The sharp angles of his face catching the light in a way that made him look almost carved from stone. She swallowed hard, trying to find her voice. I wasn't... Relax, he said, and there was that almost smile again. Faint, but unmistakable. I'm not going to bite. Jane's pulse hammered in her throat. She wanted to believe him, but everything about his presence screamed danger. Not the kind that came with fists or weapons, but something subtler. Something that got under your skin and made you forget why you were supposed to be afraid in the first place. Why are you here? She asked, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. Robert raised an eyebrow. It's a party. That's not what I meant. Jane straightened. forcing herself to meet his eyes, even though it felt like staring into the sun. "Why are you talking to me?" Victoria said. "Victoria." He repeated the name like it tasted sour. "Your stepmother." Jane blinked. "How do you know that?" Robert didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a slow sip from his glass, his gaze never leaving hers. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, more deliberate. "I make it my business to know things," he said. "Especially when someone walks into a room like this looking like a lamb surrounded by wolves." Jane's stomach twisted. "I can take care of myself." "Can you?" The question wasn't mocking. It was genuine. And that made it worse, because she didn't have an answer. She wanted to say yes, wanted to believe that she was strong enough, smart enough, to navigate whatever this world threw at her. But the truth was, she'd been out of her depth the moment she'd stepped through those doors. "I don't need your protection," she said instead, lifting her chin. Robert's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, something that might have been respect. "Fair enough," he said. Then, leaning in just slightly, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating off him, he added, "But you're going to get it anyway." Jane's breath caught. "Why?" "Because," he said simply, "you're the only person in this room who doesn't want something from me." The honesty in his words hit her like a wave. She didn't know what to do with it, didn't know how to reconcile the man standing in front of her, dangerous, calculating, powerful, with the vulnerability buried beneath that single admission. Before she could respond, a commotion erupted near the entrance. Voices rose sharply, cutting through the music and the hum of conversation. Jane turned instinctively, her eyes searching for the source of the disturbance. A man had entered the ballroom. Tall, impeccably dressed, with silver hair slicked back and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He moved through the crowd like he owned it, people parting for him the same way they had for Robert. But where Robert's presence had felt magnetic, this man's felt predatory. Jane watched as his gaze swept the room, calculating and cold. And then, impossibly, his eyes landed on her. Her blood ran cold. "Who is that?" she whispered. Robert's entire demeanor changed. The easy confidence that had marked his posture vanished, replaced by something harder, sharper. His jaw clenched, and when he spoke, his voice was low and dangerous. "That," he said, "is Marcus Vale. And if he's here, tonight just became a lot more complicated." Marcus Vale moved through the ballroom like a shark cutting through water, smooth, deliberate, and utterly aware of the fear he inspired. Jane watched him from her position near the window, her pulse quickening with each step he took deeper into the crowd. People smiled at him, shook his hand, leaned in to hear whatever quiet words he offered. But she could see it, the tension in their shoulders, the way their laughter came just a beat too late. They weren't welcoming him. They were placating him. "Don't look at him." Robert's voice was barely above a whisper, but the command in it was unmistakable. Jane tore her gaze away from Marcus and back to Robert, whose expression had hardened into something unreadable. The warmth that had been there moments ago, the faint hint of a smile, the curiosity in his eyes, was gone, replaced by a cold focus that made her stomach twist. "Why?" she asked, keeping her voice low. "Who is he?" Robert's jaw tightened. "Someone you don't want to draw attention from." "But he looked at me." "I know." The words came out clipped, almost frustrated. Robert shifted slightly, angling his body so that he stood between her and the rest of the room. It was subtle, but intentional. A barrier. "That's why you're going to stay right here and let me handle this." Jane's heart hammered against her ribs. "Handle what? What's going on?" Robert didn't answer. His eyes tracked Marcus across the room, following his movements with the kind of intensity that made Jane realize this wasn't just caution. This was strategy. Whatever relationship existed between these two men, it wasn't cordial. It was a battlefield, and she'd somehow wandered into the middle of it. Marcus stopped near the center of the ballroom, accepting a glass of champagne from a passing waiter. He raised it in a toast to no one in particular, his smile sharp and knowing, and then, slowly, deliberately, His gaze slid back to Jane. This time she couldn't look away. His eyes were pale, almost colorless, and they held hers with a weight that felt like a hand pressing down on her chest. He didn't move toward her. Didn't need to. The message was clear. I see you. Robert stepped forward, breaking her line of sight. We're leaving. What? Jane blinked up at him, confusion flooding her already overloaded mind. I can't. Victoria doesn't matter right now. Robert's hand closed around her elbow, firm but not rough, and he began guiding her toward the side exit. Trust me. I don't even know you. The protest came out louder than she intended, and a few heads turned in their direction. Jane bit down on her lower lip, forcing herself to lower her voice. You can't just... Yes, I can. Robert's tone left no room for argument. He didn't slow down, didn't look back, just kept moving with a purpose that made it clear he wasn't going to be deterred. You can argue with me later. Right now, you need to move. Jane's instincts screamed at her to pull away, to demand answers, to do something other than blindly follow a man she'd met less than an hour ago. But there was something in Robert's voice, a note of urgency that overrode her fear, that made her feet keep moving. They slipped through a set of French doors that led onto a stone terrace overlooking the gardens. The cool night air hit Jane's face, a sharp contrast to the oppressive warmth of the ballroom. Her breath came in short, shallow bursts as Robert finally released her arm and turned to face her. What the hell was that? She demanded, her voice shaking despite her best efforts to sound steady. Robert raked a hand through his hair, the first crack in his otherwise impenetrable composure. For a moment, he didn't answer. He just stood there, staring out at the dark expanse of the gardens, his shoulders tense and his expression carved from stone. You need to leave, he said finally. Now. I already told you. I can't just... Jane. He turned to look at her, and the intensity in his eyes stole the rest of her words. Marcus Vale is not someone you can afford to be noticed by. If he's taken an interest in you, it's because he thinks you're connected to me. And trust me when I say that is the last thing you want. Jane's chest tightened. Why would he think that? Robert's laugh was short and humorless. Because I made the mistake of talking to you in front of half the city's elite. People saw. They'll talk. And Marcus thrives on information. I still don't understand. Jane wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the humid night air. Who is he? And why do you care if he saw me? Robert hesitated. She could see the war playing out behind his eyes, the debate over how much to tell her. Finally, he exhaled slowly and stepped closer. Close enough that she could see the faint scar above his left eyebrow, the way his pupils had blown wide in the dim light. Marcus Vale runs half the criminal enterprises in this city, he said quietly. Drugs, weapons, money laundering. If it's illegal and profitable, he's got his hands in it. And he doesn't like competition. Jane's blood went cold. Competition? My family's business isn't clean. The admission seemed to cost him something, the words dragging out slowly, reluctantly. We operate in the same circles, control the same territories. For years we've maintained a balance, a truce. But recently things have shifted. Marcus thinks I'm making moves against him. Are you? Robert's gaze locked onto hers, unflinching. Yes. The single word hung between them like a grenade with the pin pulled. Jane took a step back, her mind reeling. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. She was standing on a terrace with a man who just admitted to being involved in organized crime, and he was telling her that she'd somehow painted a target on her back by simply existing in the wrong place, at the wrong time. I need to go, she whispered. Yes, Robert agreed. But not alone. I don't need... Jane. He closed the distance she'd created, his hand reaching out to gently, so gently, grasp her wrist. His thumb brushed against her pulse point, and she knew he could feel how fast her heart was racing. If Marcus saw you with me, he's already making plans. He'll use you to get to me, and I can't let that happen. Why not? The question came out sharper than she intended. Why do you care? You don't even know me. Robert's expression softened, just a fraction. No, he said. But I know what Marcus does to people he sees as leverage, and I won't let that happen to you. Jane wanted to argue. Wanted to tell him that this was insane, that she could take care of herself, that she didn't need some dangerous stranger appointing himself her protector. But the truth was, she was terrified. And the only thing more terrifying than Robert was the idea of facing Marcus Vale without him. "What do you want me to do?" she asked, hating how small her voice sounded. Robert's shoulders relaxed, just slightly. "Come with me. I'll take you somewhere safe, somewhere Marcus can't reach you. Just for tonight. Tomorrow, we'll figure out the rest. And Victoria? I'll handle Victoria." Jane didn't know how he could possibly handle her stepmother. Didn't know what kind of power he wielded that made him think he could control someone like Victoria Langford. But the certainty in his voice was enough to make her believe him, at least in this moment. "Okay," she whispered. Robert nodded once, then turned and began walking down the terrace steps toward the gardens. Jane followed, her mind numb, her body moving on autopilot. The sounds of the party faded behind them as they moved deeper into the shadows, the music and laughter replaced by the chirp of crickets and the rustle of leaves. They reached a side gate hidden behind a row of hedges. Robert produced a key. How did he have a key? And unlocked it, pushing the iron bars open with a low creak. Beyond it, a sleek black car waited, its engine purring softly in the darkness. Robert opened the passenger door and gestured for her to get in. Jane hesitated for only a moment before climbing inside. The leather seats were cool against her skin, the interior smelling faintly of cedar and something else she couldn't name. Expensive. Masculine. Robert slid into the driver's seat and pulled away from the estate without a word. Jane watched the mansion disappear in the side mirror, its lights growing smaller and smaller until they were swallowed by the night. She didn't know where they were going. Didn't know if she'd just made the biggest mistake of her life. But as she glanced at Robert's profile, his jaw set, his hands steady on the wheel, his entire focus on the road ahead, she realized something. For the first time all night, she felt safe, and that scared her more than anything else. The city blurred past the car windows in streaks of neon and shadow. Jane pressed her forehead against the cool glass, watching the world transform from glittering high-rises to quieter residential streets, then into industrial districts she didn't recognize. The silence between her and Robert was thick, weighted with questions she didn't know how to ask, and answers she wasn't sure she wanted to hear. He drove with the same controlled precision he seemed to apply to everything else. Calm, focused, entirely in command. His hands rested loosely on the steering wheel, but Jane noticed the way his eyes flicked to the rearview mirror every few seconds, checking, assessing, looking for threats she couldn't see. "Where are we going?" she asked finally, her voice barely cutting through the hum of the engine. "Somewhere Marcus won't think to look," Robert replied, without taking his eyes off the road. "That's not an answer. It's the only one I have right now." Jane bit back her frustration. She wanted to push, to demand clarity, but exhaustion was beginning to creep in around the edges of her panic. The adrenaline that had carried her through the last hour was starting to fade, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness that made her limbs feel heavy. Robert turned down a narrow side street, the car's headlights illuminating rows of warehouses with darkened windows and rusted fire escapes. Jane's pulse quickened again. This didn't look safe. This looked like the kind of place people got hurt. Robert, trust me. Those two words again. He said them like they were simple, like trust was something that could be given without question. But Jane had learned long ago that trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. Still, when he pulled up to a nondescript building and killed the engine, she didn't run. Robert got out first, circling around to open her door before she could reach for the handle. The gesture was old-fashioned, almost courtly, and it caught her off guard. He offered his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it. His palm was warm, his grip steady, and he didn't let go until she was standing securely on the cracked pavement. "This way," he said, guiding her toward a side entrance half hidden in shadow. Jane's heels clicked softly against the ground as she followed him, her senses on high alert. The air here smelled different, concrete and oil, with an undercurrent of something metallic she didn't want to think about too hard. Robert punched a code into a keypad beside the door, and it swung open with a heavy clank. Inside, the building was cleaner than she'd expected. The hallway was narrow but well lit, the walls painted a neutral gray. They passed several closed doors before Robert stopped at one near the end of the corridor. He unlocked it with a physical key this time, pushing the door open and stepping aside to let her enter first. Jane hesitated on the threshold. Everything about this situation screamed danger. She was alone with a man she barely knew, in a place no one else knew about, and he'd already admitted to being involved in criminal activity. This was how horror stories started. But when she looked at Robert, really looked at him, she didn't see a threat. She saw someone who was tired. Someone carrying a weight he'd never asked for but couldn't put down. She stepped inside. The space was sparse but functional. A loft-style apartment with exposed brick walls, high ceilings, and large windows covered with thick blackout curtains. A couch sat in the center of the room, facing a coffee table stacked with files and what looked like blueprints. A small kitchen occupied one corner, and a staircase led up to what Jane assumed was a bedroom. Robert closed the door behind them and locked it. 3 separate locks, she noticed. Then he moved to the windows, checking each one methodically before seeming satisfied. "You can sit," he said, gesturing toward the couch. "I'll make coffee." Jane lowered herself onto the edge of the cushions, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She watched as Robert moved into the kitchen, his movements efficient and practiced. He didn't ask how she took her coffee, just set about making it with the kind of focus that suggested this was a ritual for him. Something calming in the midst of chaos. "How long have you lived here?" she asked, more to fill the silence than out of genuine curiosity. "I don't," Robert replied, filling the coffee maker with water. "This is a safe house. One of several." "Several? In my line of work, you need options." He turned to look at her, leaning back against the counter. "Places you can disappear to when things get complicated. And things are complicated now." "Yes." Jane swallowed hard. "Because of me." Robert's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. "No. Because of Marcus. You're just collateral." The word stung, even though she knew he didn't mean it cruelly. That's what she was to him. An unintended consequence. A complication he hadn't planned for. And yet he'd still pulled her out of that ballroom, still brought her here, still seemed determined to keep her safe. "Why?" she asked quietly. Robert pushed off the counter and crossed the room, settling into the chair across from her. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his gaze fixed on hers with an intensity that made her breath hitch. "Because," he said slowly, "I've spent my entire life watching people get hurt because of my family's choices, my father's choices, and I'm tired of it." The honesty in his voice was raw, unfiltered. Jane felt something shift in her chest, a crack in the armor she'd built around herself. This man, this dangerous, complicated man, was giving her pieces of himself she hadn't asked for, pieces she didn't know what to do with. "What happened to your father?" she asked before she could stop herself. Robert's jaw tightened. "He's dead. Killed 6 months ago in a deal that went wrong. Marcus was behind it, though we could never prove it. And now I'm trying to clean up the mess he left behind while keeping Marcus from taking everything we've built." Jane's throat tightened. "I'm sorry." "Don't be." Robert's voice was flat. "He wasn't a good man, but he was my father, and I owed him something. So here I am." The coffee maker beeped, breaking the moment. Robert stood and returned to the kitchen, pouring 2 mugs and bringing them back. He handed one to Jane, their fingers brushing briefly. The touch sent a jolt through her, unexpected and electric. "Thank you," she murmured, wrapping her hands around the warm ceramic. Robert nodded and sat back down. For a while, they just drank in silence, the weight of the night pressing down on them. Jane's mind raced, trying to piece together everything that had happened, trying to make sense of how she'd ended up here. But every time she thought she had a handle on it, another question surfaced. "What happens tomorrow?" she asked finally. Robert set his mug down on the table, his expression unreadable. "Tomorrow I make sure Marcus understands that you're off limits." "And how do you do that?" "By reminding him that there are lines even he doesn't cross." Jane's stomach nodded. "Will it work?" Robert didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, His voice was quiet, almost resigned. I don't know. The admission hung between them, heavy and uncertain. Jane set her own mug down, her hands trembling slightly. She hated this. Hated feeling powerless. Hated being dependent on someone else for her safety. But what choice did she have? I should call Victoria, she said, reaching for her purse. She'll be looking for me. No. Jane froze. What? Don't call her. Robert's tone was firm. Not yet. If Marcus is watching, and he will be, he'll use her to find you. She's my stepmother. She'll call the police. Robert's laugh was bitter. Victoria won't call the police. She'll call her connections, and those connections will lead straight back to Marcus. Trust me, Jane. The less she knows right now, the safer you are. Jane wanted to argue, but deep down she knew he was right. Victoria didn't care about her. Not really. If anything, she'd probably see this as an inconvenience, a disruption to whatever plans she'd had for the evening. The realization stung, but it wasn't surprising. Okay, Jane said softly. I won't call her. Robert nodded, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. You should rest. It's late. Jane glanced toward the staircase. Where will you sleep? Here. He gestured to the couch. You take the bed. I can't. Yes, you can. Robert's expression softened, just slightly. I'm not going to sleep anyway. Might as well make sure someone does. Jane wanted to protest, but exhaustion was winning. Her body ached. Her mind felt sluggish. And the idea of lying down, even in a strange bed, in a strange place, was too tempting to resist. Thank you, she said again, standing on unsteady legs. Robert stood as well, and for a moment, they just looked at each other. The space between them felt charged, alive with something Jane didn't have a name for. She wondered if he felt it too. The pull, the connection that defied logic and reason. Good night, Jane, he said quietly. Good night, Robert. She climbed the stairs slowly, her legs heavy with fatigue. The bedroom was simple, a large bed with crisp white sheets, a nightstand, a lamp casting soft light. Jane kicked off her shoes and crawled under the covers, still wearing her dress because she didn't have anything else. Downstairs, she could hear Robert moving around, the faint clink of glass, the creak of the couch as he settled onto it. And despite everything, despite the danger, the uncertainty, the sheer insanity of the situation, Jane felt a strange sense of calm. She closed her eyes and let sleep pull her under. Jane woke to the sound of rain. It took her a moment to remember where she was. The unfamiliar ceiling, the weight of sheets that smelled like clean laundry, and faintly of cedar. Then it all came rushing back. The party, Marcus Vale's cold eyes, Robert's urgency as he'd pulled her away, the safe house. She sat up slowly, her body stiff from sleeping in her dress. Gray morning light filtered through a gap in the curtains, casting the room in muted tones. The rain pattered steadily against the windows, a rhythm that might have been soothing under different circumstances. Jane swung her legs out of bed and padded barefoot to the door, listening. Silence. No sounds from downstairs. For a brief, panicked moment, she wondered if Robert had left her here alone. But when she descended the stairs, she found him exactly where he'd said he would be. He was asleep on the couch, one arm thrown over his eyes, his chest rising and falling in the deep, even rhythm of exhaustion. His jacket was draped over the back of the chair, his tie loosened and hanging askew. Even in sleep, he looked tense, like some part of him was still on guard. Jane stood there for a moment, just watching him. In the harsh light of day, the situation felt even more surreal. This was Robert Harrington, a man whose name carried weight and danger in equal measure, and he was crashed on a couch in a safe house because he'd decided she was worth protecting. She moved quietly into the kitchen, searching for something to do with her hands. The coffee maker was still half full from last night, the liquid cold and bitter. She dumped it and started a fresh pot, the familiar routine grounding her. You didn't have to do that. Jane jumped, spinning around to find Robert sitting up, rubbing a hand over his face. His hair was mussed, his eyes still heavy with sleep, and the vulnerability of it caught her off guard. I didn't mean to wake you, she said. You didn't. Robert stood and stretched, his shirt pulling tight across his shoulders. "I don't sleep much these days." Jane turned back to the coffee maker, giving herself something to focus on that wasn't the way his voice sounded rough with sleep. "Did anything happen last night? After I went upstairs?" "No, it was quiet." "That's good, right?" Robert didn't answer immediately. When Jane glanced back at him, his expression was distant, thoughtful. "It depends." "On what?" "On whether Marcus is playing a long game or just waiting for the right moment." A chill ran down Jane's spine. She poured 2 mugs of coffee and handed one to Robert, their fingers brushing again. This time, the jolt wasn't as surprising, but it was no less potent. "What do we do now?" she asked. Robert took a sip, his gaze fixed on something beyond the window. "I need to make a call, set up a meeting." "With Marcus?" "No. With someone who can act as a neutral party. Someone Marcus will listen to." Jane frowned. "And if he doesn't?" Robert's jaw tightened. "Then we move to plan B." "Which is?" He looked at her then, his eyes dark and serious. "You don't need to know that yet." The dismissal stung, but Jane swallowed it down. She was out of her depth here, and they both knew it. Still, being kept in the dark made her feel helpless in a way she hated. "Can I at least call Victoria today?" she asked. "Let her know I'm okay?" Robert considered this, his expression unreadable. "Yes, but not from your phone. Use mine, and keep it brief." He pulled a sleek black phone from his pocket and handed it to her. Jane stared at it for a moment, trying to decide what she would even say. "Hi, Victoria. Sorry I disappeared. I'm with a dangerous man who may or may not be saving my life from another dangerous man. Don't worry about me." She dialed her stepmother's number, her stomach twisting as it rang. Victoria answered on the 3rd ring, her voice sharp with irritation. "Who is this?" "It's Jane." A beat of silence. Then, "Where the hell are you?" "I'm safe," Jane said carefully. "I just needed to leave the party early." "Without telling me? Do you have any idea how embarrassing that was?" People were asking questions. Jane's chest tightened. Of course. Victoria wasn't worried about her well-being. She was worried about appearances. "I'm sorry," Jane said, the words automatic. "I'll explain everything when I get back." "When will that be?" Jane looked at Robert, who shook his head slightly. "I don't know yet." Victoria's sigh was audible even through the phone. "Fine. But you better have a good explanation, Jane. This kind of behavior is unacceptable." "I understand." The line went dead. Jane handed the phone back to Robert, her hands shaking slightly. "She's furious. She'll get over it." Robert pocketed the phone and drained the rest of his coffee. "I need to make that call now. Stay inside and don't answer the door for anyone." "Where are you going?" "Just downstairs. There's a secure line in the office." He paused, then added, "You'll be safe here." "I promise." Jane nodded, though the idea of being alone, even in a locked apartment, made her uneasy. Robert must have seen it on her face because he hesitated, then stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating off him. "I meant what I said last night," he told her, his voice low. "I won't let Marcus get to you. Whatever it takes." "Why?" Jane whispered. "Why do you care so much?" Robert's expression softened, and for a moment, she thought he might actually answer. But then he just shook his head, stepping back. "Lock the door behind me," he said. And then he was gone. Jane did as he asked, sliding all 3 locks into place before retreating to the couch. She wrapped herself in the blanket Robert had used, the fabric still holding his scent. Wood smoke and something darker, more complex. The rain continued to fall, a steady drumbeat against the windows. Jane closed her eyes and tried not to think about how her life had been turned upside down in less than 24 hours. Tried not to think about the man who'd appointed himself her protector, or the dangerous world she'd stumbled into. But most of all, she tried not to think about the way her heart had stuttered when Robert had looked at her, like she was something worth saving, because that kind of thinking was dangerous, and Jane had enough danger to deal with already. Robert returned an hour later, his expression grim. Jane heard the locks disengage and stood quickly, her pulse spiking despite knowing it was him. He stepped inside, rain dripping from his hair and darkening the shoulders of his jacket. He looked exhausted. "What happened?" Jane asked. Robert closed the door and locked it again before answering. "The meeting's set for tonight. Neutral ground. Marcus agreed to talk." "That's good? It's something." Robert shrugged out of his jacket and draped it over the chair. "But Marcus doesn't do anything without a reason. He's going to want something in exchange for leaving you alone." Jane's stomach sank. "What kind of something?" "I don't know yet. But whatever it is, I'll handle it." "You keep saying that, but—" "Jane." Robert crossed the room in 3 strides, stopping just in front of her. His hands came up to rest gently on her shoulders, his touch warm even through the fabric of her dress. "I know this is hard. I know you're scared. But you have to trust that I know how to navigate this world. Marcus is dangerous, but he's also predictable. And I've been playing this game a lot longer than you have." Jane looked up at him, searching his face for any sign of doubt. She found none. Just that same steady certainty that had been there since the moment they'd met. "Okay," she said quietly. "I trust you." Something shifted in Robert's expression. Surprise, maybe, or relief. His hands tightened on her shoulders for just a moment before he let go and stepped back. "Good," he said, his voice rougher than before. "Now, we need to get you something to wear. You can't stay in that dress forever." Jane glanced down at herself, suddenly aware of how wrinkled and disheveled she must look. "I don't have anything else." "I know. Which is why we're going shopping." "Shopping?" Jane's eyes widened. "We're leaving?" "Just for an hour. There's a place nearby, discreet, no cameras. We'll be in and out before anyone notices." Jane wanted to argue, wanted to say that leaving felt too risky, but the idea of staying in this dress for another minute was almost unbearable. "Okay." They took a different car this time, a nondescript sedan that blended seamlessly into traffic. Robert drove them to a small boutique tucked between a laundromat and a corner store, the kind of place Jane would have walked past without a second glance. Inside, the shop was surprisingly elegant, with racks of simple but well-made clothing and a middle-aged woman behind the counter, who greeted Robert with a knowing nod. "Mr. Harrington," she said. "It's been a while." "Margaret." Robert inclined his head. "I need your help." Margaret's gaze shifted to Jane, taking in her rumpled dress and bare feet. Jane had refused to put her heels back on. "I see. Give me 10 minutes." She disappeared into the back, leaving Jane and Robert alone among the racks. Jane wandered over to a display of sweaters, running her fingers over the soft fabric. Everything here was beautiful, understated. Nothing like the flashy designer pieces that had filled the ballroom last night. "How do you know her?" Jane asked. "Margaret used to work for my mother," Robert replied, "before she passed. She's discreet." Jane filed that information away, another piece of the puzzle that was Robert Harrington. Margaret returned with an armful of clothes, jeans, shirts, a lightweight jacket, even undergarments that made Jane's cheeks flush. She ushered Jane into a small changing room and left her to it. The clothes fit perfectly, as if Margaret had taken one look at Jane and known exactly what she needed. Jane emerged in dark jeans and a soft gray sweater, feeling more like herself than she had in days. Robert's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer than necessary before he turned to Margaret. "Put it on my account," he said. "Of course." They left the boutique with a bag of additional clothes, and Jane felt a small measure of relief. At least now she could face whatever came next without feeling like she was wearing a costume. The drive back to the safe house was quiet. Jane watched the city pass by, her mind churning. She thought about Victoria, about the life she'd left behind. Small, controlled, suffocating. And she thought about what Robert had said. "You're real." She'd never felt real before. Not in the way he'd meant it. She'd always been a shadow, moving through life without leaving a mark. But in the span of one night, Robert had seen her. Really seen her. And that terrified her almost as much as Marcus Vale did. They were halfway back when Robert's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and his entire body went rigid. "What is it?" Jane asked. Marcus moved up the meeting. Robert's voice was tight, controlled. "It's happening now." "Now, but..." We don't have a choice. Robert yanked the wheel, taking a sharp turn that sent the car skidding slightly. He's at the docks, and he wants you there. Jane's blood turned to ice. Me? Why? Because he knows it'll make me sloppy. Robert's jaw clenched. He wants to see how far I'm willing to go to protect you. Then we don't go, Jane said quickly. We disappear, leave the city. And then Marcus wins. He takes everything I've been fighting for. And next time, he won't stop with intimidation. Robert's hands tightened on the wheel. No, we go. But we do it on my terms. Jane's heart hammered against her ribs. Every instinct screamed at her to refuse, to demand he turn the car around. But she could see the determination in Robert's face, the steel in his eyes. He'd made his decision. And somehow, she'd become part of it. What do I need to do? She asked, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. Robert glanced at her, something unreadable flickering across his face. Stay close to me. Don't speak unless he asks you a direct question. And no matter what happens, don't react. Marcus feeds on fear. Okay. They drove the rest of the way in silence. The docks loomed ahead, a sprawling maze of shipping containers and warehouses. The rain had stopped, leaving everything slick and gray. Robert parked the car near an abandoned loading bay and killed the engine. Ready? He asked. Jane wasn't, but she nodded anyway. They walked side by side toward the meeting point, Robert's presence a solid wall of protection beside her. Ahead, Jane could see figures waiting, 3 men in dark coats, and in the center, Marcus Vale. He smiled when he saw them. Robert, Marcus called out, his voice carrying easily across the empty space. You brought her. How disappointing would it have been if you hadn't? Robert's hand found the small of Jane's back, a touch so subtle she almost didn't register it. But she felt the message behind it. I'm here. You're not alone. Let's get this over with, Marcus, Robert said, his voice devoid of emotion. Marcus took a step forward, his pale eyes fixed on Jane with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Up close, he was even more unsettling than he'd been in the ballroom. There was something wrong about him, something that lived beneath the expensive suit and practiced smile, something predatory. You must be Jane, Marcus said, as if they were meeting at a cocktail party. Robert has such interesting taste these days. Jane forced herself to meet his gaze, remembering Robert's instructions. Don't react. But her heart was a war drum in her chest, and she could feel sweat beating at her temples despite the cool air. She's not part of this, Robert said flatly. She never was. Marcus tilted his head, studying them both with the detached curiosity of a scientist examining insects. Isn't she, though? The moment you spoke to her, the moment you removed her from that party, you made her part of this. He paused, letting the words sink in. You made her relevant. Then I'm unmaking her relevant. Robert's voice dropped, taking on an edge that Jane had never heard before. Whatever problem you have, it's with me. Leave her out of it. Oh, Robert. Marcus laughed, the sound empty and cold. You still don't understand how this works, do you? Power isn't about territory or money. It's about leverage. And right now, standing in front of me, you've just shown me yours. Jane felt Robert's hand press more firmly against her back. She could feel the tension radiating off him in waves, could sense the careful control he was exerting to keep himself in check. This was a man balanced on a knife's edge, and Marcus knew it. What do you want? Robert asked. Marcus spread his hands in a gesture of mock innocence. The same thing I've always wanted. Your father's territories, his contacts, his operations. All of it, handed over with a smile and a handshake. That's not going to happen. Then we have a problem. Marcus's smile didn't waver, but his eyes went flat. Dead. Because I'm not asking anymore, Robert. I'm telling you, sign everything over to me by the end of the week, or I start taking things that matter to you. The threat hung in the air like poison. Jane felt ice spreading through her veins, felt the weight of Marcus's gaze as it slid back to her. She understood now. She wasn't just leverage. She was the example, the demonstration of what Marcus was willing to do. You touch her, Robert said quietly, and there won't be anywhere in this world you can hide. Marcus raised an eyebrow, Is that a threat? It's a promise. For a long moment, the two men stared at each other, and Jane could feel the electricity crackling between them. This was years of animosity condensed into a single point, a conflict that had been building long before she'd ever walked into that ballroom. Then Marcus laughed again, breaking the tension. I like you, Robert. You've got your father's fire, even if you lack his vision. He took a step back, gesturing to his men. But fire without control just burns things down. Think about my offer. You have until Friday. He turned to leave, then paused, looking back over his shoulder at Jane. And Miss Jane, I'd be very careful about the company you keep. Robert has a habit of getting people killed. The words hit like a physical blow. Jane felt Robert stiffen beside her, felt the rage that flared through him even though his expression remained carefully neutral. Marcus and his men walked away, disappearing between the shipping containers, their footsteps echoing and then fading into silence. For several seconds, neither of them moved. Jane's legs felt weak, trembling beneath her, and she realized she was shaking. The adrenaline that had been holding her together was starting to fracture, leaving behind raw fear and the delayed shock of what had just happened. Come on, Robert said quietly, his hand moving to her elbow. Let's go. They walked back to the car in silence. Jane's mind was spinning, Marcus's words playing on repeat. Robert has a habit of getting people killed. What did that mean? How many people had been hurt because of the Harrington family's war with Marcus Vale? Robert opened the passenger door for her, and she slid inside, her body moving on autopilot. He got in beside her, but didn't start the engine. Instead, he just sat there, hands gripping the steering wheel, knuckles white. Robert, I'm sorry. The words came out rough, scraped raw. I'm sorry I dragged you into this. I'm sorry I made you a target. I should have stayed away from you at that party. Should have let you disappear into the crowd. Jane turned to look at him, and what she saw made her chest ache. He looked haunted, guilty, like he was carrying the weight of every bad decision he'd ever made. You saved me, she said softly. If you hadn't talked to me, if you hadn't gotten me out of there, I would have spent the rest of that night completely alone. Invisible. I've been invisible my whole life, Robert. You were the first person who actually saw me. Robert's head turned, his eyes finding hers. The vulnerability in his expression stole her breath. Seeing you might get you killed. Maybe. Jane's voice was steadier than she felt. But at least I'll have been seen. Something shifted between them in that moment. The air in the car felt charged, thick with an emotion Jane didn't have words for. Robert reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and cupped her face with one hand. His palm was warm against her cheek, his thumb brushing just below her eye. You're braver than you think, he said quietly. Jane leaned into his touch without thinking, her eyes closing briefly. When she opened them again, Robert was closer. So close she could count the shades of brown in his eyes, could see the faint scar above his eyebrow, could feel his breath against her lips. Robert, she whispered, and she didn't know if it was a question or a warning or a plea. He answered by closing the distance. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, as if he was afraid she might break. His lips moved against hers with a softness that contradicted everything else about him. The danger, the power, the barely controlled violence she'd witnessed at the docks. This was different. This was careful. This was a man giving her the choice to pull away. Jane didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned in, her hands coming up to rest against his chest. She could feel his heart hammering beneath her palms, feel the way his breath hitched when she kissed him back. The kiss deepened, becoming something more urgent, more desperate, like they were both trying to prove something to themselves, that this was real, that they were real. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard. Robert rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed, his hand still cradling her face. We can't do this, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. I know, Jane whispered back. Neither of them moved. The moment stretched, suspended in the gray afternoon light. Jane could feel her pulse in her throat, could feel the heat of Robert's body so close to hers. Everything about this was wrong. The timing, the circumstances, the danger. But it felt more right than anything had in years. Finally, Robert pulled back, his hand dropping from her face. He started the engine without looking at her, his jaw tight. "We need to get you somewhere safer," he said. "Marcus knows about the safe house now. He'll have people watching it. Where will we go?" "I have another place, outside the city. No one knows about it except me." Robert pulled out of the parking space, his eyes scanning the mirrors constantly. "We'll lay low there until I figure out how to handle this." Jane wanted to ask what handling this meant. Wanted to know if he was actually considering Marcus's ultimatum. But the kiss had shifted something between them, made the air feel fragile, and she didn't want to break it yet. They drove in silence as the city gave way to suburbs, then to rural roads lined with trees still bare from winter. The landscape transformed into something softer, quieter, and Jane felt some of the tension begin to drain from her shoulders. Out here, away from the glittering ballrooms and dark warehouses, it was easier to pretend that the last 24 hours had been a dream. But she knew better. Marcus Vale's pale eyes were seared into her memory, and so were his words. "You have until Friday. 3 days." They had 3 days to figure out how to stop a man who seemed to hold all the power. Robert turned down a long gravel drive, trees arching overhead to create a tunnel of branches. At the end of it sat a small cabin, rustic but well-maintained, with smoke curling from the chimney as if someone had been expecting them. "You have someone taking care of this place?" Jane asked as they pulled up to the porch. "I do." Robert killed the engine and turned to face her. "His name is Thomas. He's loyal. You can trust him." The front door opened before they could get out, and an older man stepped onto the porch. He was tall and lean, with silver hair and eyes that held the same careful assessment Jane had seen in Robert's. This was someone who'd lived through things, someone who knew how to survive. "Robert," Thomas greeted him with a nod. Then his gaze shifted to Jane, and his expression softened slightly. "Miss." "Thomas, this is Jane," Robert said, helping her out of the car. "She'll be staying here for a few days." Thomas's eyes flickered between them, and Jane had the distinct impression that he was reading a story neither she nor Robert had fully written yet. But he simply nodded again. "I'll prepare the guest room," he said, and disappeared back inside. Robert led Jane up the porch steps and into the cabin. The interior was warm and inviting, with exposed wooden beams, a stone fireplace, and furniture that looked comfortable rather than expensive. It was the kind of place that invited you to breathe, to let your guard down. "It's beautiful," Jane said softly. "It was my grandfather's," Robert replied. "The only place connected to my family that doesn't feel tainted." Jane understood. This was his sanctuary, the place he came when the weight of his world became too much. And he'd brought her here. The significance of that wasn't lost on her. Thomas appeared again, gesturing toward a hallway. "The room's ready whenever you'd like to rest, miss." "Thank you," Jane said, suddenly aware of how exhausted she was. The adrenaline crash was hitting hard now, leaving her limbs heavy and her mind foggy. Robert touched her elbow gently. "Get some sleep. We'll figure out the next move when you wake up." Jane wanted to protest, wanted to stay and help plan whatever came next. But her body betrayed her, a yawn escaping before she could stop it. Robert's expression softened into something almost tender. "Go," he said. "I'll be here." Jane let Thomas lead her to a small bedroom with a quilted bed and lace curtains that filtered the afternoon light into something soft and golden. She kicked off her shoes and crawled under the covers, not bothering to change out of her new clothes. As she drifted toward sleep, she could hear Robert's voice drifting from the main room, low and serious as he spoke with Thomas. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was enough. They were planning, strategizing, fighting. Jane closed her eyes and let the exhaustion pull her under. Robert's kiss still burning on her lips like a brand. Jane woke to the smell of wood smoke and something cooking, something rich and savory that made her stomach growl. For a disoriented moment, she didn't know where she was. Then memory flooded back. The docks, Marcus Vale's threats, Robert's kiss. She sat up slowly, her body stiff from tension she'd been carrying without realizing it. The light coming through the curtains had shifted, turned amber with the approach of evening. She'd slept for hours. Jane found the small bathroom attached to the guest room and splashed cold water on her face, trying to shake off the lingering fog of sleep. Her reflection in the mirror looked different somehow. Her eyes were brighter, more alert, despite everything. As if danger had woken something up inside her that had been sleeping for years. When she emerged into the main room, she found Robert and Thomas at a large wooden table covered in papers and photographs. They both looked up as she entered, and Robert's expression shifted into something warmer. "You're awake," he said. "Hungry?" "Starving." Thomas stood and moved to the kitchen area, ladling what looked like stew into a bowl. He brought it to Jane along with thick slices of bread, and she accepted it gratefully. The first bite was heaven. Rich and hearty, exactly what she needed. "Thank you," she said to Thomas, who nodded and returned to the table. Robert was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "How are you feeling?" "Tired, confused, terrified." Jane managed a weak smile. "Pick one." "All valid options." Robert leaned back in his chair, the papers in front of him temporarily forgotten. "We've been working on options. Ways to deal with Marcus that don't involve giving him everything." Jane set down her spoon. "What kind of options?" Robert exchanged a glance with Thomas, who gave a slight nod. "Marcus's power comes from his network, the people he has in his pocket. Politicians, police, judges. If we can expose those connections, we can weaken his position significantly." "Expose how?" "I've been gathering evidence for months," Robert said, gesturing to the papers. "Financial records, communications, testimonies from people he's burned. Enough to build a case that would bring down half the city's leadership." Jane's eyes widened. "Then why haven't you used it?" "Because the moment I go public, Marcus will know it came from me, and he'll retaliate." Robert's jaw tightened. "Before, I was willing to take that risk. My life, my organization. That was the price I accepted. But now I'm in the equation." Jane finished quietly. "Yes." The weight of that single word settled over the room. Jane looked down at her bowl, her appetite suddenly gone. She'd become the thing that made Robert hesitate, the weakness Marcus had identified and was already exploiting. "What if I wasn't?" she asked. Robert's head snapped up. "What? What if I left? Disappeared? Would you be able to move against Marcus then?" "No." The word came out sharp, almost angry. Robert stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "That's not an option." "Why not? If I'm the thing holding you back." "You're not a thing." Robert crossed to her in 3 strides, dropping to a crouch beside her chair so they were eye level. "You're not leverage or a weakness or a problem to be solved. You're—" He trailed off, and Jane saw something vulnerable flash across his face. Something he wasn't ready to name. "You're important," he finished quietly. "To me. And I'm not letting Marcus dictate what happens to people who matter." Jane's breath caught. The intensity in his eyes was almost too much to bear, but she couldn't look away. "I matter?" "Yes." No hesitation. No doubt. Just simple truth. Jane felt something crack open inside her chest. She'd spent so long being invisible, being told, implicitly and explicitly, that she didn't matter, that hearing those words now felt revolutionary. Dangerous. "Then what do we do?" she whispered. Robert's hand came up to rest on her knee, a touch that was grounding rather than possessive. "We find a third option. Something Marcus won't see coming." Thomas cleared his throat from across the room, and they both looked over. The older man's expression was carefully neutral, but Jane thought she saw approval in his eyes. "I may have a suggestion," Thomas said. Robert straightened, moving back to the table but keeping himself positioned between Jane and Thomas, as if even here, in this safe place, he needed to maintain that protective barrier. "I'm listening," Robert said. Thomas tapped one of the photographs. A man in a suit, caught mid-conversation at what looked like a restaurant. "Sebastian Crane. He used to run with Marcus, back before your father and Vale had their falling out. But he got out, moved to Europe, built a legitimate business empire." "I know who Crane is," Robert said slowly. "What about him?" "He still has connections to the old network. people who owe him favors. And from what I hear, he has no love lost for Marcus. Vale tried to extort him 2 years ago, before Crane left the country. Thomas leaned back. If you could convince Crane to back you, provide testimony, financial support, political protection, you'd have a counter to Marcus's power. Robert was quiet for a long moment, considering. Crane doesn't do anything without a price. Everyone has a price, Thomas agreed. The question is whether you're willing to pay it. Jane watched the exchange, feeling like she was observing a chess match played in a language she only half understood. But she could see the wheels turning in Robert's mind, weighing options and consequences. Where is Crane now? Robert asked. London. But he's scheduled to return to New York next week for a charity gala. Next week is too late. Marcus's deadline is Friday. Thomas nodded. Then you'd have to go to him. The implication hung in the air. Robert would have to leave. Leave the city. Leave his operations. Leave his position of strength. And possibly leave Jane. I'll go, Robert said finally. Jane's stomach dropped. When? Tomorrow. Robert's eyes found hers across the room. Which means tonight we plan, we prepare, and we make sure that if something goes wrong, you have an exit strategy. What about you? Jane heard herself ask. What's your exit strategy? Robert's smile was sad. I don't have one. I stopped planning exits a long time ago. The finality of those words chilled Jane to the bone. This was a man who'd accepted that his war with Marcus might end in his own destruction. And yet he was still fighting, still trying to find a way to protect her while dismantling his enemy. Thomas excused himself, disappearing into another room and leaving them alone. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across the walls. Outside, night had fallen completely, turning the windows into black mirrors. Jane stood and crossed to Robert, drawn by something she didn't fully understand. He watched her approach, his expression unguarded in a way it hadn't been before. When she reached him, she didn't stop, just stepped into his space and wrapped her arms around him. For a heartbeat, he didn't react. Then his arms came around her, pulling her close, and Jane felt him exhale against her hair. They stood like that, holding each other in the firelight, two people who'd found something unexpected in the midst of chaos. I don't want you to go, Jane whispered against his chest. I know. Robert's hand moved to her hair, fingers threading through the strands. But this is the only way I can keep you safe. What if something happens to you? Then Thomas will get you out of the country. New identity, new life, far away from all of this. Jane pulled back to look at him. I don't want a new life. I want this one, with you in it. The confession hung between them, raw and honest. Robert's eyes darkened, and Jane saw the war playing out behind them. Duty versus desire, protection versus possession. Jane, he said, and her name sounded like a prayer. You don't know what you're saying. Yes, I do. She reached up, her hand cupping his face the way he'd done to her in the car. For the first time in my life, I know exactly what I'm saying. Robert closed his eyes, leaning into her touch. When he opened them again, they were filled with something that looked like surrender. One night, he said quietly. Give me one night where we don't talk about Marcus or exits or what comes next. Just this. Jane understood. He was asking for a moment of peace before walking back into war. A memory to carry with him to London, to whatever confrontation with Sebastian Crane would bring. Okay, she whispered. Robert took her hand and led her to the couch in front of the fire. They sat close, her head resting on his shoulder, his arm wrapped around her. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. But inside, in the circle of warmth cast by the flames, they were safe. For now. For tonight. And tomorrow could wait. Morning came too soon. Jane woke on the couch, wrapped in a blanket she didn't remember pulling over herself, with Robert's jacket rolled up as a pillow beneath her head. She sat up slowly, disoriented, and found him across the room, dressed in dark clothes and speaking quietly into his phone. When he saw she was awake, he ended the call. I didn't want to wake you, he said, pocketing the phone. When do you leave? Jane's voice was rough with sleep. In an hour. Thomas has arranged transportation. Robert moved to sit beside her, and Jane noticed the shadows under his eyes. He hadn't slept. "I've left instructions. Everything you need is in the envelope on the table. Money, new identification, emergency contacts. If I don't come back by Thursday night—" "Don't," Jane interrupted. "Don't talk like that." Robert's expression softened. "I have to. This is the reality we're living in, Jane. And I need to know you'll be okay." Jane grabbed his hand, squeezing hard. "Come back and I'll be okay. That's the only plan I'm interested in." Something flickered across Robert's face. Surprise, hope, fear all tangled together. He leaned forward and pressed a kiss to her forehead, lingering there as if committing the moment to memory. "I'll do my best," he promised. An hour later, Jane stood on the porch and watched the tail lights of his car disappear down the gravel drive. The morning was cold and gray, the sky threatening rain. She wrapped her arms around herself and tried not to think about how empty the world felt without him in it. Thomas appeared beside her, 2 mugs of coffee in his hands. He offered one to her silently, and they stood together, watching the space where Robert's car had been. "He'll come back," Thomas said after a while. "He always does." Jane wanted to believe him, but she'd seen Marcus Vale's eyes, heard the steel in his voice, and she knew that whatever Robert was walking into, it wouldn't be simple. The next 2 days passed in a strange limbo. Jane helped Thomas with small tasks around the cabin, chopping vegetables, organizing firewood, anything to keep her hands busy and her mind from spiraling. But every time a car passed on the distant road, her heart would leap, hoping it was Robert returning early. It never was. By Thursday evening, Jane's nerves were frayed to breaking. She paced the main room while Thomas pretended to read, neither of them acknowledging the weight of the deadline hanging over them. Midnight. If Robert didn't return by midnight, she was supposed to activate the escape plan. Leave everything behind and disappear. At 11:30, headlights cut through the darkness outside. Jane was at the door before Thomas could stand, her heart in her throat. The car that pulled up wasn't Robert's. It was larger, more expensive, with tinted windows that made it impossible to see inside. "Jane, step back," Thomas said sharply, moving to put himself between her and the door. But before he could reach her, the car door opened, and Robert stepped out. Jane's legs nearly buckled with relief. He looked exhausted, his clothes rumpled, a cut above his eyebrow that hadn't been there before. But he was alive. He was here. She ran to him without thinking, and Robert caught her, his arms closing around her so tightly she could barely breathe. She didn't care. She buried her face against his chest and felt his heart beating strong and steady. "I'm okay," he murmured against her hair. "I'm okay, Jane." "What happened?" she asked when she could finally speak. Robert pulled back just enough to look at her. "Crane agreed to help, but it's going to cost me." "What kind of cost?" "The kind I can live with." Robert's smile was tired but genuine. "Marcus will have Crane's testimony and financial records delivered to him tomorrow morning, along with a message that if anything happens to you, to me, or anyone else I care about, every piece of evidence I have goes public. It's mutually assured destruction. Not perfect, but enough to keep Marcus in check." Jane felt tears burning behind her eyes. "It's over?" "The immediate threat, yes. Marcus won't move against you now." Robert's hand came up to cup her face, his thumb brushing away a tear that had escaped. "You're safe. What about you?" "I'm working on that part." Jane laughed, the sound watery but real. Then, because she couldn't help herself, because he was here and alive and looking at her like she was the only thing in the world that mattered, she kissed him. This kiss was different from the first. There was no hesitation, no testing of boundaries. It was gratitude and relief, and the beginning of something neither of them had names for yet. Robert kissed her back with the same intensity, his hands tangling in her hair, pulling her closer. When they finally broke apart, both of them breathless, Robert rested his forehead against hers. "Stay," he said quietly. "Don't disappear. Don't run. Just stay." Jane's answer was simple, certain, the easiest decision she'd ever made. Yes. 6 months later, Jane stood in the same ballroom where her life had changed, But everything about it felt different now. The crystal chandeliers still sparkled, the champagne still flowed, and the city's elite still moved through the space with practiced grace. But this time, she belonged. The dress she wore was elegant without being flashy, deep blue silk that whispered against her skin. Her hair was styled softly, and around her neck hung a simple pendant that Robert had given her last month. She wasn't invisible anymore. People knew who she was now. Robert Harrington's partner. The woman who'd somehow tamed the untamable. She smiled at the thought. No one had tamed anyone. They'd simply found each other in the chaos and decided to stay. Robert appeared at her elbow, 2 glasses of champagne in his hands. He'd cleaned up his operations over the past months, cutting ties with anything that crossed the line from gray to black. It had cost him money, influence, old alliances, but he'd done it anyway. For her, he said. But Jane suspected it was also for himself, for the man he wanted to be instead of the one he'd been raised to become. "Enjoying yourself?" he asked, handing her a glass. "More than last time," Jane admitted. Robert's smile was slow and warm. "Good. Because this time, you can leave whenever you want. No escape necessary." Jane clinked her glass against his. "What if I don't want to leave? Then we stay." Robert's free hand found hers, fingers intertwining. "As long as you want." Across the room, Jane caught sight of Victoria, who was pointedly not looking in her direction. They'd spoken exactly once since that night. A brief, cold conversation where Jane had made it clear she wouldn't be returning to her stepmother's house. Victoria had responded by cutting her off completely. Jane found she didn't mind. Marcus Vale was nowhere to be seen. According to Thomas, he'd retreated to his own territory, licking his wounds and biding his time. The truce held, but it was fragile. Jane knew they'd have to deal with him eventually. But that was a problem for another day. Tonight was for celebrating, for proving that they'd survived, for dancing in the same ballroom where Robert had first seen her, first decided she was worth saving. "Dance with me?" Robert asked, setting down his glass. Jane did the same, then took his offered hand. He led her onto the floor, and as the music swelled around them, she let herself relax into his arms. They moved together easily now, all the rough edges smoothed by time and trust. "Thank you," Jane said quietly. Robert looked down at her, confused. "For what?" "For seeing me," she said. "That first night, for looking at me when everyone else looked through me." Robert's expression turned serious. "I'll always see you, Jane. You're impossible to miss." And as they turned beneath the chandeliers, surrounded by the glittering world that had once seemed so hostile, Jane believed him. She'd walked into this ballroom 6 months ago dressed too simply, feeling too small, certain she didn't belong. But the Tycoon's gaze had changed everything, had changed her. And now, held in Robert's arms, she finally understood what it meant to be seen, to be valued, to be chosen. The song ended, but they didn't let go. Outside, the city hummed with its usual chaos, deals being made, power shifting, danger lurking in every shadow. But in this moment, in this space carved out just for them, they were untouchable. And that was enough. The end.